It started with a referendum. Now, with 72 days to go before the United Kingdom is due to exit the European Union, the rest of the EU is trying to make sense of the leadership crisis in London. Theresa May coming off the biggest parliamentary defeat for a sitting government, and yet the Prime Minister expected to survive a vote of no confidence. Despite the urgency of the crisis, there is still suspense as to whether she'll invite the leader of the opposition to cross-party talks. Said leader of the opposition, who's quietly resisting loud calls within his own camp to put a second referendum on Brexit ahead of Jeremy Corbyn's push for a general election. And neither leader seems popular beyond their base, but then again, the same goes for anyone else in what looks like a leadership vacuum in the land of Winston Churchill. So what does the EU do? Wait for London to finally decide what it wants and run the risk of a no-deal Brexit that could cause chaos all around? Or put the whole business on hold until there's resolution on what started as a referendum and has morphed into a full-blown institutional crisis? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the UK's Brexit Dismay, and with us from Strasbourg, Conservative member of the European Parliament, Charles Tannock. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
From London, Dalia Gabral, editor at Novara Media. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Good evening.
John Henley is The Guardian's European Affairs correspondent. Welcome to the show.
Good evening.
And he's a former Director General for the budget at the European Commission. Hervé Jouan-Jean, of the Vice Chair of the think tank Confrontation Europe. How do you translate that?
Good evening.
Confrontations Europe?
Europe, confrontations, maybe.
Right. Okay. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. 24 hours ago, we were wondering if politically Theresa May could afford to lose by 50 or 100 votes. Instead, her divorce deal got rejected by a record 330 votes. This is the breakdown. And here's how the Prime Minister reacted immediately after the vote and the response today from across the aisle.
The government has heard what the House has said tonight. But I ask members on all sides of the House to listen to the British people who want this issue settled and to work with the government to do just that.
If a government cannot get its legislation through Parliament, it must go to the country for a new mandate.
Charles Tannock, is Theresa May fit to still be Prime Minister of England?
I think she will definitely survive the vote of no confidence, but I agree we're in uncharted territory as far as where we go from here. The majority, by the way, was 230 votes, not 300 and something. But clearly, the way she seems to be handling it at the moment, from what I gather from my colleagues in London, is that she treats it more of a protest vote on a large scale, and that it will be business as usual for the British government vis-à-vis the end game of the Brexit negotiations. So she hasn't really budged on her red lines, unfortunately. She's consulting across Parliament, but as a precondition to the Labour Party, she said that we have to leave the customs union, which is clearly written into the political declaration of the withdrawal agreement. So I can't see her meeting Labour halfway. So if the idea is to reach out to Labour and get them to vote again on this issue, say in February, after she's been to the 27 and try to get some tweaks to the political declaration, I think that's not going to be very successful a strategy. People like me, who are very pro-European, passionate Remainers, and my colleagues, about 11 of the MPs who are openly now declared for a people's vote, a second referendum, we are hoping that she would grant that and put it back to the electorate. But it looks like neither a general election nor a people's vote is something which Mrs. May is entertaining at this stage. But of course, you know, we are moving very quickly in terms of shifts. Jeremy Corbyn may have to get off his fence after he loses the vote of no confidence later and he may have to come down in favour of the Labour Party supporting a people's vote, which will give it considerable momentum. But otherwise, the other obvious alternative would be to pivot towards a Norwegian-style European Economic Area, or even one with a customs union as well, which would probably have a majority of the House of Commons. And that could be done by changing the political declaration, and then the deal goes through and we have the 2-year transition period in which to negotiate it. But again, Mrs May is very much against remaining in the single market in particular, because it means freedom of movement of people. So there is no obvious solution. But one thing
So
I'm
will she budge?
increasingly
Will she
considering
budge?
is that she may have... Well, I think she may have to do... I don't really think she or the majority of the House of Commons will want to have a no-deal, catastrophic, cliff-edge Brexit. I think that will be far too damaging to the reputation of the Conservative government, and we would have to take ownership of it as a party, and we would be punished at the next general election, which is what Mr Corbyn would like. So my view is that at some point in the next few weeks, there will be a formal request to extend Article 50, maybe until the end of June, to try and resolve this impasse. But beyond that, it really is your guess is as good as mine of which of those various scenarios, you know, the no deal, the second referendum, the Norwegian option, any one of these might happen, but none of them are probable to happen, which makes it very difficult for anybody to predict the future.
Charles Tynick rightfully pointing out it's 230 the margin, not 330. And as Charles was saying, the Prime Minister ready for cross-party talks, but the leader of the Conservatives in Parliament, Andrea Leadsom, on BBC Radio's Today Show, seemed to rule out inviting Jeremy Corbyn.
Jeremy Corbyn had the opportunity yesterday to put to the House exactly what his alternative proposals were. He clearly has none, and instead what he wants to do is to seek to disrupt government and disrupt the nation at a crucial time
so she's written
by
him
seeking
off.
a general election. Well, no, I don't think she's written him off at all, but he needs to come to the table and tell us what he wants to do.
John Henley, let's cut to the chase here. You heard Charles Tannock say everyone's kind of banking on the fact, even the markets are banking on this, that there's going to be a delay in when the UK has to leave the European Union. Not inviting Jeremy Corbyn, it's part of this playing the clock game?
Well, I think that's probably the strategy, yes. But I mean, I think where it is likely to fall down is that the EU, I think, is very unlikely to entertain any further approach from Theresa May until she can go to them with something that it is at least likely to have a majority in the House of Commons. You know, they're sort of fed up with playing games as much as anybody else. And, you know, I think really the only, of all the solutions that Charles Tannock mentioned, the prerequisite to all of them is that the British Parliament has to sit down and hammer out a deal that will be acceptable across the House.
I mean, this is a big deal, right? Brexit. So why wasn't there a cross-party negotiation at the outset back in 2016?
Well, in part, because Theresa May and the government decided there were many ways that you could have interpreted that vote, right? I mean, it was a very narrow majority, whatever way you look at it, 52-48. Some governments in that circumstance might have said, this is a hugely sensitive and incredibly important issue. You know, we will try and work out some kind of approach of national unity. We'll reach out, you know, across the aisle in the House of Commons. We'll consult widely, and we'll come up with an approach, you know, that is not just likely to get a majority in Parliament, but will be acceptable, not perfect, but acceptable to both sides of the debate. Theresa May didn't do that. She essentially went for probably the most extreme version of Brexit possible, which was to say, we will leave the single market and we will leave the customs union. And, that made the deal that and then further to that, she then triggered Article 50 with this 2-year negotiating period. She set the clock ticking without having an agreement within her own government on what version of Brexit to pursue beyond the kind of have your cake and eat it, impossible, unrealistic version of Brexit, which the European Union was never going to accept. So in a way, what we're seeing today actually is the wholly inevitable consequence of that approach from the outset. You hesitate to use the word dictatorial, but basically the government decided what it was going to do, and it pushed for it, despite all the warnings and all the signs that this was precisely where that approach was going to end up.
So can you reach out at this particular point in time? Is it possible to reach across the aisle? The parties, the main parties are splintered. Dalia Gibral, you heard Charles Tannock earlier pointing out that Jeremy Corbyn is going against a majority of those within his own party who want that second referendum. He's grudgingly talking about it. Instead, he's putting the emphasis elsewhere, most notably on a general election. How do you reach out and come up with a common stance in the UK?
Yeah, so I think in terms of what the Labour Party, what the party members have voted for at conference, actually the proposition that won the most votes was to primarily fight for a general election, and then if a general election is not possible, then to put forward for a people's vote. So actually, at this stage, by trying to call for a general election, Jeremy Corbyn is fulfilling the democratic mandate of his party. What I would say about the question of Theresa May and the Tories, I think what this moment has demonstrated is that the Conservative Party, there's two elements here. There's the Conservative Party itself, which is structurally unable to deliver a cohesive deal on Brexit that they agree on internally, because from the moment that Britain joined the EU, there have been these splits within the Tory party. And I personally can't see Theresa May coming up with a deal that would appease both sides of that huge gulf. And then there's the question of Theresa May herself. I completely agree that Theresa May's crush the saboteurs approach to this has both alienated and created hostility within the EU and within Parliament. So at this stage, I think she's really put herself into a corner. And I think this whole idea that Theresa May or the Conservatives more broadly represent a more competent sort of bureaucratic force is a farce. I mean, from the moment that David Cameron won that election in 2015, it's been bad call after bad call.
Yeah, but
from
Dalia,
the
let me ask you
referendum itself, which, as we touched on before, it's a very bad referendum question in itself because it didn't have the alternative laid out, to now the way that she's played this so hardball, she's now on her own essentially and unable to deliver.
Let me go back to what you said.
Makes anyone happy.
Let me go back to what you said at the outset there. This call for a general election, the vote of no confidence, that's the mandate given to Jeremy Corbyn, you say. If it all goes to script, it's going to fail along party lines. Are you expecting Corbyn, as of Thursday morning, to then push for that second referendum vocally?
Well, that is what the party have. That's what the democratic mandate of the party is. So I expect that at least some kind of opening of putting of that option on the table in a serious way, I'm certainly expecting.
Certainly expecting it. And could the consensus, or at least a majority view, come out of London beyond party lines? Can it be like-minded people from different parties?
For me, I think that the most likely deal that could get a parliamentary consensus would be something akin to what Labour is proposing now, which is essentially a soft Brexit, in which we remain part of the single market, we remain part of the customs union, or we have a new customs union, and we forefront workers' rights and environmental protections. So that kind of I think that's the only thing that really would appease the parliamentary majority. Obviously, the kind of hard Remainers and hard Brexiters will never agree to the same thing. But I think that the majority of the country, and I think that parliamentary consensus sits within that kind of soft Brexit framework.
So let me ask you, Hervé Grandjean, at this point in time, again, 72 days to go, the markets this Wednesday, they seem to be taking it all in stride. We haven't seen any big run on the pound. Everybody thinks this is a drama that's just going to keep playing?
Well, this has to come to an end. I mean, maybe the markets did not react today.
So could we sleepwalk into a no-deal Brexit?
I don't think so. I think it is a catastrophe for all of us. An enormous catastrophe for the UK because it is relatively small. A less important catastrophe for the EU because you are 6-7 times bigger, so difference in size. Now, my feeling is that you've got to come to grips to that. And I think at the latest, a solution has to be found before the end of June. Why before the end of June? Because on the 1st of July, you have a new European Parliament. And I cannot imagine 1 second that the British government would turn to the voters and would say, sorry, 3 years ago you voted against the European Union, but we would kindly ask you to elect new members of the European Parliament until we leave the European Union. I think this would be a farce. I mean, you use this word, it is a farce. So it has to be sorted out. Now, the solutions. Mrs. May has put on herself a tremendous amount of constraints. No freedom of circulation for people, which means you cannot have the European Economic Area solution. We leave the internal market, therefore, but also no customs union. But if you can keep the customs union with the EU, you can solve the Irish problem. And what is the problem today? We have the internal British politics and we have the Irish problem. Internal British politics, this is for you, British people. And certainly I do agree that the Labour Party and the reasonable Conservatives should come to an agreement on something. The customs union is the only way out if you want to leave. Now,
Customs union is the only way out. We have to take a quick break. We'll pick up on this point and also ask Charles Tannock if he's running for re-election at the European Parliament. When we come back, you're watching the France 24 debate.
An exceptional sparkling wine, a symbol of celebration the world over. This week, France in Focus invites you to discover champagne. Don't miss it on France 24 and France24.com. France 24, every art form.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're watching for you in the newsroom. Theresa May expected to survive that vote of no confidence that's to take place in the next hour. 1 day after the British Prime Minister's Brexit plan suffered by a loss by an unprecedented 230 vote margin. The 20-hour siege of an upscale Nairobi office and hotel complex ends with all the assailants killed. The attack claimed by the radical Al-Shabaab group. A total of 14 dead could rise, 50 people unaccounted for. The International Criminal Court rejects the call to keep Laurent Gbagbo behind bars during the appeal of the former Ivory Coast president's clearing on genocide charges. Andalusia's conservatives take the reins after decades of socialist rule, this in part thanks to the first far-right lawmakers elected in Spain since the end of dictatorship in 1975. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. And we're looking at the crisis in London after the rejection of Theresa May's divorce deal. With us to talk about it from Strasbourg, Conservative member of the European Parliament, Charles Tannock. Welcome back as well to Dalia Gabriel, editor at Novara Media, who is with us from London. John Hendley, European Affairs editor for broadsheet The Guardian. And Hervé Jouan-Jean, of Consultation Europe, the think tank, and also former Director General of the Budget at the European Commission. I promised I'd ask, here on France 24, Charles Tannock, are you declaring your candidacy for another mandate at the European Parliament?
Well, I mean, I would love to serve for another 5 years as an MEP, and had Brexit not been the outcome of the referendum almost 3 years ago, I would have undoubtedly tried to become a candidate again to serve London, which I've represented for 20 years now as an MEP, as a Conservative. It's highly unlikely that Britain will remain in the European Union as of yet, but it's a very fluid situation. If my group of activists within the party, in alliance nationally with other like-minded individuals, we are successful in securing the second referendum people's vote, and people like me will be campaigning strongly for Remain, because we believe now not only does the British public understand far better what the EU does for the United Kingdom, but also many more young people now can vote who will undoubtedly vote for Remain, because their freedom of movement is going to be stripped from them through Brexit. So I'm confident if we get the people's vote, we will get a Remain outcome. And that is precisely why the Brexiteers will fight it tooth and nail and prevent it to become an option in these various possible scenarios which pan out before us over the next few months. But of course, if we have a people's vote with the Remain outcome, and of course it's Remain and Reform, I would of course be reapplying to stand as a candidate. Now, whether my party would select me, given my passionate Remain views, is another question. I also happen to be an Irish citizen, and I'd be perfectly happy to be a candidate in other European Union countries if that were possible, but that's not going to happen. But I am a strong European, and I would love to be an MEP, but I have to resign myself to the fact that for now it's still a very unlikely possibility.
Still very unlikely, however. You mentioned Brexiteers. Our own Catherine Norris-Trent caught up with Theresa May's former Brexit minister, a strong advocate of leaving the European Union. And he put his own brand of positive spin on the vote Tuesday evening to reject the divorce deal.
The good thing about it is it's a very clear message to the European Union. We've got to reset this negotiation properly, put it on a fairer basis, and a basis that serves both sides. And we want to do that, and that's what I think the Prime Minister will go back to do.
A very clear message, Hervé Jouan-Jean, to the European Union that we have to reset this negotiation. How far is he going to get with that reasoning?
Nowhere. Nowhere. For the simple reason that the European Union has, I think, negotiated extremely fairly with the UK. And, I mean, the problem we have is a very limited problem. It's a problem of confidence. It's a problem of confidence on the Irish border issue. And this has been instrumentalized by, in particular, the Brexiters and the Irish party, the DUP. I mean, it's a matter of confidence. If we can solve this problem, it is over. The agreement is extremely good for both parties. Nobody in Brussels will move to put Ireland in a much more difficult situation. It's a very complex situation. We have found a very balanced political agreement on this issue. nobody will move. The only way I see to solve, or the only ways I see to solve the problem, that either the UK stays in following a referendum, or we have the customs union, which will ensure that the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland will remain open. I mean, there is no other option.
It's binary, is what you're saying. And again, we're talking as the clock ticks towards that March 29th deadline. As it does, as John Henley was mentioning earlier, the big talk today is about whether or not to push back that date. Kathy Clifford has more.
Where does the EU go from here? Largely, leaders are putting the onus on the UK to come up with alternatives, such as giving up on its bid to leave the EU customs union and the single market. Some states have suggested they'd be open to extending the March 29th deadline, though the European Commission has said London would have to show exactly what it aimed to achieve if a delay was agreed.
C'est juridiquement.
It's legally possible, it's technically possible. The British need to ask, and there needs to be a unanimous agreement between the 27 member states to say, OK, you chose the 29th of March as your leaving date, and you're asking us, OK, we'll push it back.
OK, on repousse.
EU Brexit negotiator Ben Barnier has firmly stated nothing within the withdrawal agreement rejected by Parliament is up for renegotiation, though said the EU would consider a UK request for closer post-Brexit ties, as the possibility of a no deal looms closer on the horizon than ever.
The risk of a no deal has never seemed so high. Our goal is to avoid such a scenario, but we also have a responsibility to remain clear-headed, which is why we will intensify our efforts to be prepared for this possibility.
So how can this be avoided? The leader of German Chancellor Angela Merkel's Bavarian coalition partners in Parliament, Alexander Dobrindt, called for Germany to lead the way in individual states engaging in direct talks with London, though Angela Merkel continues to advocate for a European united front.
We will try to find an orderly solution, but we're also preparing for the possibility that no such orderly solution can be found. We still have time to negotiate, but we're now waiting to see what the British Prime Minister proposes.
Though Merkel is sticking to the EU line, on Tuesday her foreign minister excluded only major changes to the withdrawal agreement, suggesting the door isn't completely shut.
John Henley, in that report, we heard the leader in the Bundestag for the CSU saying, why don't we spearhead direct talks? Do you see any daylight in the positions between Berlin, Paris, and the other 25 members?
Well, it's always been this myth. It's been part of the Brexit myth. In fact, about a month before the referendum, David Davis, who was interviewed in the previous clip there, wrote an article saying that, of course, Britain would get the deal that it wanted because Germany sold so many cars to Britain and France sold so much wine, and that the first thing that Britain would be able to do after the referendum was won would be to go and start talking individually to other member states, and cut individual trade deals, which, for somebody who went on to become Brexit minister showed a kind of startling level of ignorance that, EU member states cannot negotiate their own individual trade deals. It has to be done collectively.
Here you've got one lawmaker who's quite important inside the CSU saying, yeah, let's try that.
It's not, they can't negotiate. Yeah, there can be no formal negotiation on an individual level of any kind of future agreement. The agreement, the European Union, the Commission has been absolutely crystal clear that this is a legal text, the withdrawal agreement, right? All 585 pages of it. It's been signed off on by 27 member states. It's being ratified as we speak. It will not be reopened. Where there is room for manoeuvre is the future trade deal,
which still has to be negotiated.
Which still has to be negotiated, and that's where there is and that future that political declaration as it exists at the moment, there is scope within that for almost any of the available Brexit options. From the kind of Norway plus customs union, soft Brexit, to a kind of a Canada plus traditional free trade agreement. Everything remains possible. And I think what the Germans are talking about, clearly there are big economic issues at play here. But there have been other German politicians today saying, if you think that Germany is going to fold because of BMW and Mercedes, then seriously think again, because for Germany, it's a very simple calculation. That the coherence of the single market for Germany is many, many times more important than a few percentage points knocked off the sales to the UK.
So, Dalia Gabral, the consensus of our panel here is that probably going to be a pushing back of that March 29th date, but the ball remains firmly in London's court. What are you personally expecting from the European Union in all of this?
Well, as has been mentioned earlier, I'm not expecting Europe to budge unless it is towards the kind of deal that Labour have put on the table. I think that it's really important, and this is what I would like to see from both parties that I have yet to see, including Labour, to be frank now with the British people that this idea that we could end freedom of movement, this idea that we could have this kind of clean, hard Brexit is not possible. That the Brexit the kind of lead that the Brexit campaign and the kind of xenophobia, the rhetoric on strong borders, on ending freedom of movement, was never possible, and it isn't now. And I think that from that position, then we can return to the negotiating table with the EU, because that question of freedom of movement is absolutely central to why the EU won't budge and why the EU doesn't need to budge, because at the end of the day, Britain is on the back foot here, not the EU.
Yeah, I think there's so much that's coming. The air, frankly, is thick with the sound of chickens coming home to roost, basically, at the moment.
So who holds power?
I completely agree that the root of the problem here, or one of the roots of the problem here, many roots of the problem, is that no one has ever levelled with the British public, and that this dream, this kind of unicorn-laden dream that the Brexiteers promised, that you could leave the EU and yet retain all the advantages, was impossible. But nobody has ever said that. And because Theresa May had to keep both sides of the argument, both
believe you me, I said it in her campaign.
Yes, I'm sure. No politician in Westminster has ever admitted it. But but because she had to keep both camps in her own party, happy, her policy has been obfuscation, basically, and draw a veil over the whole thing and keep it as vague as possible for as long as possible. And that's why we now.
Which brings us back to the gridlock that we see, and also the question of where is the power. It's almost as if triggering that referendum. And right now here in France, Dalia, there's talk about more citizens' initiatives, the need for the government to directly ask the people their opinion, not go through Parliament as much. Do you regret the fact that a referendum was called?
I think that first of all, any political scientist will tell you that the referendum was a very badly phrased referendum. It was a very badly run referendum.
But more broadly, the principle of referendums, what do you think of them now?
You need to be able to have a clear, cohesive idea of what the alternative is. Well, I think that I'm for direct democracy, but I think that the principle of a referendum, particularly in a context where, 3 companies own such a huge percentage of our media, where we aren't getting transparent information, it kind of doesn't really work as a tool of democracy in the way that it was initially conceived of. So I think that it's not just the question of the mechanism of a referendum, but it's about the political context in which that referendum happens. So, for example, can you put a promise that there's £350 million that is going to go into the NHS on the side of a bus when you know darn well that that's not going to happen? The whole political context in which these referenda are happening aren't conducive to them being actually exemplary of democracy. And I think was absolutely the wrong context, both in the sense that it was run on a largely xenophobic platform, and also the fact that it was done to try and save the Tories a couple of seats from going to UKIP. That's not a reason to run a referendum that is going to fundamentally change the course of British history.
You're not opposed to the principle of staging referendums.
No, I mean, it obviously depends. I think the referendum on abortion in Ireland, for example, that was run in a more effective way. I think that it depends what the issue is, and it depends on the context. And I think that the context of this one was transparently, David Cameron putting his party and putting his leadership over the good of the country. And I also think that a lot of the issues that were ignited around Brexit, around questions of people not feeling democratically engaged, people not feeling in control of their own destiny and their own kind of communities, people feeling, the weight of austerity, a lot of those things surfaced in the Brexit conversation. But in the EU referendum, but are not actually solvable by leaving the EU. So I think that a lot of things came into play in the EU referendum that are not actually about the technical membership of the EU itself.
All right, let me turn to the
precisely.
I think
that.
Let me turn at this point. Sorry about this. There's a bit of a Skype delay, which means I'm constantly interrupting you.
Yeah.
Let me turn to the Frenchman in the room here, Hervé Jean-Jean.
Okay.
Since the referendum in 2016, which has since highlighted the splintering in both of the mainstream Conservative Party and the mainstream opposition party, the Labour Party. We've seen the splintering of the traditional political centre-left and centre-right blocs here in France, with the Yellow Vests movements coming now. Again, institutions appear weak. At this point in time, despite what's happened in the UK, a lot of calls for more referendums, for more citizens' initiatives. Why is that?
Probably because there is a lack of confidence in politicians. The question is that we should have more confidence and we should have more competent politicians sometimes. This is a feeling which we have in many sectors. Having said that, the referendum in France has generally been a very bad experience, because people do not answer the question which is being asked. They do not vote for the question, they vote for the people. I remember the Maastricht Treaty in France. When I was in my region, in the center of France, talking to people, they didn't talk about the Maastricht Treaty. They talked about President Mitterrand, and they said, I don't want to say yes to this man. So they didn't think about the future of the European communities of these days. They talked about Mitterrand. And in the past of the history of France, if you look at the various referenda, it has always been the same history. So we must be extremely careful. Referenda have to be very much concentrated on very precise questions which have no link at all with politics, and it is very hard to find such issues.
Charles Tannock, at this point in time, how do you rebuild strength in the political institutions in one of the world's oldest democracies, the United Kingdom?
Well, I certainly think that the referendum, not only has it proven itself to be very hollowed out in terms of its legitimacy, because not only were false promises made, lies were told, the franchise was very bizarre in Britain, which denied all my family in Europe, my British mother in Paris, a vote, my European Union citizen wife a vote, and these are the people most impacted by the outcome, and yet allowed all the Commonwealth voters who aren't EU citizens a vote in Britain in the referendum. And of course we have the issue of more money was spent than permitted. They've been fined by the courts. There's allegations of foreign funding of the referendum campaign. But because it was an advisory referendum, it's not subject to legal review. And of course I think David Cameron, now in retrospect, he was very cavalier in the legislation. There should have been a supermajority. There should have been a majority of the constituent nations of the United Kingdom to prevent this situation now with Scotland and Ireland maybe the 16-year-olds should have been given a vote. But I think for a binary question where clearly no legislation was in place or clear model as to what leave meant, or what it meant in terms of were we going to have a soft or a hard Brexit and so on, has resulted in this absolute chaos. So I have to say it's left a very bad flavour in my mouth for future referendums. But having said that, I'm actually campaigning for a second referendum on this one issue, because I think politically and constitutionally, it'd be very hard to reverse a referendum without another referendum. But clearly, they are not fit for purpose in something as complex as leaving the European Union after 46 years of generating and building the project together. And I always said that during the campaign, it would never be simple, it would never be quick, and that Britain did not hold all of the cards. But, you know, I do think the other thing that's been demonstrated by this referendum is the limits of the British constitutional system of first past the post, of the incredible power vested in the executive, where we really don't have a tradition of PR. We don't have a great tradition. We haven't got our own constitutional court, and Crown prerogative is very powerful. And of course, what wasn't said earlier in terms of the mistakes, Mrs. May called a general election after triggering Article 50 and didn't get the mandate for the hard Brexit which she wanted, or the working majority in the Parliament to deliver on it. And she wouldn't budge on her red line. She had the Lancaster House speech, which wanted the hardest form of Brexit, but she didn't actually have the numbers in Parliament to deliver it. And now, 2.5 years on, we're seeing that with the catastrophic vote last night. So I have to say, you know, the old Greek tragedy, you know, hubris leading to nemesis, because there was so much triumphalism by people like David Davis and Dr. Fox at the beginning that it would be quick, it would be easy, we held all the cards. You know, that
just very briefly, because
European citizens were our best bargaining chip. And
we're almost out of time. Very briefly, John Henley, a lot of people say they don't want that second referendum because it's already so ugly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that's certainly a legitimate argument that, you know, and that's the complaint that's made in France, it's made in Denmark, you know, that you know, the ruling class will simply go on holding referendums until they get the result that they want. And there is a danger that, you know, you would diminish faith in democracy. You know, for quite a period to come. And a lot of people who voted leave would feel robbed. And there were people interviewed today in my paper who said, you know, I will never vote again if there's a second referendum. But I think, as Charles Tannock was saying, you know, and Dahlia as well, you know, that this particular referendum, the original referendum, was so profoundly flawed that really the only way out of it now is to give people a choice, but an informed choice, where they actually know what they're voting for or against.
All right, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, John Henley. I want to thank
informed consent. I use the medical term.
Charles Tannock, many thanks for joining us from Strasbourg. Dahlia Gabriel in London. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.